Welcome back, everyone. We are very happy that you are staying with us. I think we had two very rich days of discussions and questions and insights from experts, practitioners, regulators, and so on. So now this is actually, I think, one of the most difficult sessions, which is to try to get the key lessons and messages and wrapping up of the 2 days. And who is better than Chris Hodge, who can actually do this? So without wasting any time, I'd like to introduce you to Chris Hodge, who is also, in addition to his titles that you have seen in the agenda, he's also, of course, we are happy to have him as one of our experts in our International Advisory Board at Hawkamah. Chris, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashraf. I'm hoping your question about who is better than me to do this was a rhetorical question, because I have a long list of people who I think who would probably be better to do it. But never mind, I'm very honoured to have been invited. And it's been a really interesting and informative couple of days, as it always is with the Hawkamah conferences. And I think the first and most important thing is to thank all the speakers and panelists for their contributions, and then to thank you, Dr. Ashraf, and all of the members of the Hawkamah team for organising such an excellent event, as you always do. And of course, many thanks also to the sponsors for enabling this to happen. The theme of the conference was to explore emerging trends in governance, the implications of those trends for boards, what the regional companies, boards and directors need to do not only to respond to the current challenges they're facing, but also to prepare for an increasingly complex set of expectations from shareholders and stakeholders. And I think the panels between them, including the one that I had the privilege of chairing, met this brief very well. The first stage is to refresh your memory, focus mainly on the effects of the pandemic, on the way in which boards operate and some of the main challenges and risks that are facing them. And today we've been hearing a lot about changing investor priorities around ESG and what that means for boards. Not surprisingly, a lot of the same issues have come up on both days, as many of the challenges highlighted by the pandemic are linked to ESG, either directly or indirectly. And one of the points I think that's been made a number of times over the last couple of days is that some of these changes are going to be permanent. Not everything is going to go back to the way it was. So I think the main question for you to take away is, what do your boards and the companies that they lead need to do to adapt to the new world in which you're operating? And I'd like to try and pick out, I think, 6 broad topics that have been discussed over the 2 days of the conference. I won't try and cover absolutely everything, because it's been far too much of a rich discussion to do that in 10 minutes. The first and main topic, obviously, is ESG. We've been hearing a lot about that over the last few hours. And I think what's come through very clearly is that boards need to focus on ESG and stakeholder issues as a business imperative, and to factor them into your discussions on your strategy, business model, risk management, remuneration, and so on. ESG is not just an optional extra or something that's only relevant to a small number of sectors. It affects all companies to some degree, whether that's as part of your own activities or and in terms of environmental and geographical factors that you don't always have any control over, but can have a significant impact on your future success, as we've seen over the last couple of years. At the very least, you need to be thinking about how to mitigate them, and indeed whether there are any other business opportunities for you. In addition, as we've heard today, there's much greater attention being paid to ESG by investors, regulators, and stock exchanges, which directly affect companies in the form of regulation, disclosure requirements, credit ratings, and so on. As I say, heard a lot about that today. It'll still be very fresh in your mind, so I won't go into any more detail about that now. But what has also come through today, and the two do come together, I think, is the greater pressure from stakeholders, including your own workforce and society, that you are expecting you to demonstrate that you're tackling these issues. And this pressure is only going to incentivize because of the generational change, both in society, but also in investors. And this is something that Stephen Davis brought out very clearly in his opening remarks today. Mentioning stakeholders brings me on to the second topic, which I would call the human factor. We've heard the phrase human capital management used today, and that's generally used in a slightly broader sense to include, for example, your supply chain, which is, and again, an issue that was highlighted this morning, but I'm thinking primarily about the people within the company at all levels. And this has come up in different forms. A lot of it's around the boardroom, board composition, in particular discussion that the panel we've just had and the first panel yesterday about diversity at the board level and to some extent below that. The second panel yesterday, the one I moderated, talked about the support that was given to employees during the pandemic to help with their well-being and the need for that sort of support to be available in good times as well as bad. And the same time, panel also touched on the need for perhaps some fresh thinking about the way in which employees as well as senior management are incentivized and how their performance is assessed to take account of changing working patterns and changes in the way the company is structured. And I think as a general observation, you often read in company reports a statement that says our people are our most important asset. You don't always see that demonstrated in action. If it is the case that you can think of them as your most important assets, then the board needs to make sure that those assets are being safeguarded and developed as it does with all the other assets of the company. I mentioned changing work patterns, which brings me to the third topic that we discussed mostly yesterday, which was the move to remote working during the pandemic for both boards and for the workforce. And the two panels yesterday discussed whether this was a permanent change or whether we're likely to revert back to previous working practices. And I think on both panels, the general view would be a mix of both. And now clearly there are many benefits from remote working in terms of efficiency and cost savings, and it allows a more flexible working, which potentially benefits both the company and the employee. But there are also some risks. We heard about the increased threat of cybersecurity yesterday, and then there are some challenges when it comes to developing a corporate culture, again, throughout the organisation, but also in the board. And Phil Armstrong, in his opening remarks for the conference yesterday, posed the question, can you build boardroom cohesion and culture around virtual meetings? Which I think is a very good question and not one I certainly have an answer to. Now, the remote working and so on is one aspect of the fourth topic, which I wanted to highlight, which is the impact of technology more generally. And we heard quite a bit about the importance of digitalization yesterday and increasing in efficiency. It can help to mitigate some ESG issues, and it also helps to create new business opportunities. I think one of the important things we were reminded of in the second panel yesterday is that if it creates business opportunities for you, it also creates them for others. And we heard some examples of that. In some sectors, at least, there is a real threat to established companies from disruptive new competitors who could potentially make your business model redundant overnight. I think boards need to be aware of these potential developments and think about how to respond to them. And like ESG more generally, this is another example of why boards need to spend as much time looking outwards at how changes in the world in which they operate will affect the company as they do looking downwards as to what's happening within the company. And that brings me on to the fifth topic, which is to, as well as looking outwards, it's important to look ahead. And this again has come through very clearly in some of the discussions over the last couple of days. This is partly about taking a long-term view and developing your strategy and business model and linking it to purpose, as was discussed earlier today. It's also about managing and mitigating risks, undertaking, for example, scenario planning. You may not be able to predict or prevent the next shock to the system of the sort that we've had with COVID, but the better prepared you are generally, the better place you'll be to deal with it when it comes. We've also had some comments from the panels yesterday about the way in which companies take decisions, particularly during a crisis, but more generally as well, and how it's important to be able to respond quickly and in an informed way. And that again is something that may be worth thinking about in terms of the way in which matters are escalated to the board and so on in your own companies. I mean, the first panel yesterday identified as one of what it saw as the sort of legacies of the pandemic being a move to greater ongoing collaboration and communication between boards and management. So that may be something that you might want to think about as a way of helping to ensure that you're able to be more responsive when issues arise like that. And that's one aspect of your internal governance, which brings me to the final topic and the main topic we were here to discuss for the last couple of days, which is the issues of whether there are any changes are needed to governance structures or governance arrangements in response to the changes in the business environment and the expectations from investors, regulators and stakeholders that we've been hearing about. And obviously, the first and most immediate aspect of this is reviewing whether there's anything that you should be doing now to address these issues. And the last panel we've just heard from, and yesterday's first panel in particular, focused on this to quite an extent. And so just a few examples of issues that came up in their discussions. does your current board have the necessary expertise and understanding of the relevant ESG issues in order to be able to take the right decisions and provide the necessary leadership? Do you need, if not, to review the composition of the board, including perhaps its diversity, or do you need to increase the training and support that they receive to help them get to grips with these issues? Do you have a board committee that has a specific remit to focus on ESG issues? Is the board sufficiently involved in developing the company's purpose and developing the long-term strategy, and so on? So, and as I say, those are just some of the issues that have been flagged by those two panels. Looking further ahead, and this is my final observation, one of the questions that came up yesterday a couple of times was whether there's a need for a more fundamental rethink of how we look at governance structures, recognizing that many companies today no longer fit the traditional hierarchical model for which the current approach to governance was designed when Robert Bush described what he called platform companies. But even for many more traditional established companies, there's been a lot of outsourcing and so on, where the direct levers from the board down to the people who are actually carrying out the company's activities may not be there anymore. So the question, I think, is does a traditional model that starts from the board and assumes that everything that the board needs to be responsible for reports directly to it in one form or other, is that still valid? And if it's not, do we need to start thinking about whether the governance structures need to adjust in the way that the environment in which companies are working has adjusted as well? But that's a bigger question, and perhaps one for a future Hawkamah conference or journal to consider, rather than one to get into with 2 minutes remaining of this conference. So those are my observations. I hope they chimed with some of the things that you've taken away from it. I'm sure there are many other specific points or action points or ideas that you've heard that you'll want to pursue, and I'd encourage you to do that. Thank you all very much for attending, and I'll now hand back to Dr. Ashraf to bring proceedings to a close.
Thank you so much, Chris. You really wrapped it all perfectly, so thank you for your efforts. Now, at the end of the conference, this actually time has passed really very fast. Sessions were very interesting, very informative for us. We learned a lot from them. At the end, I'd like to thank our experts, our panelists, our audience, and of course our sponsors who made this possible to happen. And a special thank you to my own team in Hawkamah, with your permission, despite that all the team has worked on this, but special thanks goes to Sadia and Arij, who did really a lot of time and effort into making this happen. Now, towards the end, I'd like also to remind you that we like to hear your voices. So please, if you have any suggestions, ideas, we do lots of events, webinars and different events. If you have ideas of topics you'd like to see us doing, we are happy to hear from you. Your criticism and recommendations for us in Hawkamah are also most welcome. We always like to hear back from you. So please go to our website, see what we're doing, give us your input and everything. Thank you so much. Thank you, Chris, and I'd like to thank everyone for being part of this event. And we'll see you in other future events, inshallah, before even our 15th conference next year. We see you in other events in the future. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Thank you.